think he was starting anything when he handed me his business card at that conference in Calgary. He was 51, recently separated, polished in the way that money makes a person polished. Good shoes, easy smile, the kind of confidence that doesn't come from achievement so much as from never having been told no. I was 29. I was there representing the nonprofit I worked for, a housing advocacy organization out of Edmonton. He was keynoting for his company, some mid-size real estate development firm that had made him comfortable enough to wear a watch worth more than my car. We talked. We kept talking. Over 3 months, we became something that neither of us named out loud. I wasn't naive. I knew he was older. I knew his divorce wasn't finalized. I knew he had 2 adult children from his first marriage, and that his life had a kind of shape to it that didn't obviously include me. But I was also 29, and he was attentive and interesting, and he made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like I was being genuinely seen. I found out I was pregnant in February. I was alone in my apartment bathroom at 6 in the morning, and the word that came to me before anything else was complicated. Not afraid, not excited, just, this is going to be complicated. I called him that evening. He was quiet for a long time after I told him. Then he said he needed a few days to think. I gave him a week. When he called back, his voice had a different quality to it. Careful. Measured. Like he'd been coached, or had coached himself. He said he cared about me. He said this wasn't something he'd planned for. He said he wanted to support me, whatever I decided to do, and that he hoped I understood the position this put him in. I asked what position that was. He said his divorce proceedings were at a sensitive stage. He said his professional reputation was something he'd spent 30 years building. He said he had a daughter my age, almost, and that this would be, and here he paused, complicated for everyone involved. I told him I was keeping the baby. I didn't ask for his opinion on that. It wasn't a discussion. Another long pause. He said he'd like to meet in person. We met at a restaurant in downtown Edmonton, neutral territory, a Tuesday afternoon when the lunch rush had cleared out. He came in looking like he hadn't slept. I almost felt something for him in that moment. Almost. He sat down. He ordered water. Then he slid an envelope across the table. He said his family had discussed the situation. He said that word, situation, and I remember my fingers going still around my glass. He said his family wanted to handle things quietly and that they hoped I would understand that this was the most practical path forward for everyone. He said there was a figure inside the envelope that they felt was more than fair. I didn't open it at the table. I just looked at him. I said, "What exactly does handle things quietly mean?" He looked down. He said they were hoping I would consider terminating the pregnancy and that in return, they were prepared to offer significant financial support, enough to set me up very comfortably, and that everything would be handled through a private agreement with no public record. I picked up the envelope. I put it in my bag. I told him I needed to think. I left the restaurant and sat in my car in the parkade for 20 minutes. Then I opened the envelope. $250,000 Canadian, a lump sum with a non-disclosure agreement attached. 3 pages of legal language that essentially said I would cease contact with him and his family, make no claim on his estate or income, and never disclose the nature of our relationship or its outcome. I read it twice. Then I drove to my sister's apartment on the south side of the city. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and put the kettle on. I sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she put a mug of tea in front of me and sat down across from me and said, very quietly, "You know you don't have to do anything they want, right?" I did know that. I just needed to hear someone say it out loud. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed going through it from every angle. $250,000 was not nothing. I had student debt. I had a lease on an apartment that barely fit one person. I was 3 years into a job I loved, but that paid $52,000 a year. The practical voice in my head, the one that had kept me functional through a difficult childhood and a harder adolescence, was making arguments I couldn't entirely dismiss. But there was another voice. And it said, "This is your child." I called a family lawyer the next morning. Her name isn't important, but she'd been practicing in Alberta for 18 years, and within 20 minutes of our first conversation, I understood that I had been handed something that looked like a lifeline, but was actually a trap. She explained that in Alberta, parental support obligations cannot be waived by private agreement. She explained that the amount being offered, while significant as a lump sum, was likely far below what a court would award in child support from someone with his income over an 18-year period. She explained that signing that NDA would not eliminate his legal obligations, but it would constrain mine. Specifically, my ability to speak about what had happened or to enforce my rights through any public channel. She said, and I remember this exactly, signing that document would cost you far more than it would give you. I asked her what my options were. She laid them out. She was clear and methodical, and she didn't moralize. She just gave me the information. I left her office with a legal aid referral, a list of documents to start gathering, and the first real sense of footing I'd had in 2 weeks. I did not sign the NDA. I had my lawyer send a letter to his lawyer stating that I was declining the private agreement and that I intended to pursue my legal rights as a parent in the province of Alberta. The letter was sent on a Thursday afternoon. His lawyer called my lawyer before 9 a.m. the following Monday. They wanted to negotiate. They proposed a revised figure, $500,000 this time, with a modified agreement that was slightly less restrictive. My lawyer called me to relay the offer. I could hear something in her voice, not quite amusement, but close. I said no. There was a period after that where I went quiet on his end, and the call stopped, and I started to wonder if he would simply do nothing, try to wait me out, hope I change my mind, or run out of energy. A lot of people in his position count on that. They count on the other person getting tired. I was tired. I won't pretend otherwise. I was 29 weeks pregnant, working full-time, and spending my evenings reading Alberta family law documents on my laptop while eating crackers and trying not to let the anxiety eat through me. My sister came over twice a week. A colleague at work who'd been through her own custody situation gave me the name of a second lawyer who specialized in high-income support cases. I called her. This lawyer was different. She was younger, direct, and she had a particular focus on cases where one party had significantly higher income than the other. She explained something I hadn't fully understood before. Child support in Canada is calculated under federal guidelines, the Federal Child Support Guidelines based on the payer's income. There is no cap in most provinces the way some American states have. If his income was what I believed it to be, the monthly support obligation under the guidelines would be substantial, and it would be legally enforceable. She also explained that I could request financial disclosure, that he would be required by law to provide documentation of his income. I said, what if he tries to hide it? She said, they usually try, and then we usually find it. I retained her. The financial disclosure process took several weeks and was not pleasant. His legal team delayed and requested extensions and at one point submitted documentation that my lawyer described in professional terms as incomplete. She filed a motion. A judge agreed that the disclosure was insufficient. They were ordered to resubmit. My daughter was born in May in a hospital in Edmonton on a Wednesday morning just after 6. My sister was with me. My mother drove up from Red Deer and arrived 2 hours after the birth and cried in a way I had never seen her cry before. Not sad crying, just overwhelmed. The way people cry when something they didn't know they were waiting for finally arrives. I was in the hospital for 2 days. I came home to my apartment, which my sister had quietly reorganized while I was in the hospital. A bassinet set up in the corner of my room, the fridge stocked, a note on the counter that said, "You've got this." The legal proceedings continued around the edges of those first few weeks in the way that bureaucratic things do, at a distance, managed mostly by my lawyer. I was focused on learning how to keep a small person alive, which turns out to take most of your available attention. The financial disclosure came back complete in late June. My lawyer called me and explained the numbers. His declared income was higher than I had estimated. The Federal Child Support Guidelines calculation put his monthly support obligation at an amount that, over the course of my daughter's childhood, would significantly exceed what his family had offered in that envelope. His legal team attempted to argue that his income had fluctuated and that certain earnings were non-recurring. My lawyer addressed each point. A court date was set. I was nervous the morning of the hearing. I dressed carefully, which felt both necessary and slightly absurd. I'd arranged for my sister to watch my daughter. I drove downtown with my lawyer, and we sat in a waiting room that smelled like recycled air and old coffee. And I thought about how strange it was that this was where things got decided, in a plain room with fluorescent lights by a person in a robe reading financial documents. He was there with two lawyers. He didn't look at me when I came in. His father, a compact man in his 70s who I recognized from photographs, sat in the gallery. I hadn't expected that. I understood in that moment why they'd wanted this to stay quiet. The hearing was procedural. Lawyers spoke. Documents were submitted. The judge asked questions. It lasted less than 2 hours. The support order was issued 3 weeks later by mail. I read it at my kitchen table with my daughter asleep in the next room. The monthly amount was more than I made in salary. It was to be paid on the first of each month, directly deposited, enforceable through the Maintenance Enforcement Program if he defaulted. The order ran until my daughter was 19 or completed her first post-secondary degree, whichever came later. I sat there for a while after I finished reading. My daughter made a small sound from her room. I got up and went in and lifted her out of the bassinet and stood by the window. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening in Edmonton. The sky was that particular shade of pale that it gets in early summer, still light at 8 o'clock. The kind of sky that always makes the city feel like it has more space in it than it actually does. I thought about the envelope. The 3 pages of fine print. The word situation. I thought about my lawyer's voice on the phone, steady and matter-of-fact, explaining to me that the law existed for a reason and that the reason was this, that a child's right to support from both parents is not something that can be bought off in a restaurant over Tuesday afternoon water. I thought about what it had cost to get here, the sleepless nights, the legal fees I partially covered through legal aid and partially through a small loan from my mother, the weeks of documents and extensions and a judge's motion and a second disclosure, the fear in the early months that I was wrong to refuse, that I was being stubborn, that the practical voice was right and I should have taken the money and been done with it. What silenced that voice eventually was a very simple thing. Not the money, not the legal outcome, not even the satisfaction of watching his father sit in that gallery knowing the way things had turned out. It was the moment I held my daughter for the first time and understood that she was entirely, undeniably real, that she existed, that she had not been erased. There are people who will look at a woman in my position and see a problem to be managed. They will reach for an envelope or a phone call or a carefully worded agreement drafted by someone who charges $400 an hour. They will use words like practical and quiet and for everyone's benefit. What they don't account for is that some people have already had the conversation with themselves about what they will and won't accept. Some people have already decided. My daughter is almost 2 now. She has her father's forehead and my stubbornness, and she laughs at things that aren't funny yet and cries at things I don't always understand. She is the most concrete fact of my life. The support payments come on the first of every month. He has never missed one. I don't know if that's because of integrity or because the Maintenance Enforcement Program makes default more trouble than it's worth. I don't spend much time thinking about it either way. My sister asked me once if I regretted any of it. The months of legal proceedings. The anxiety. The nights when I sat in my car outside the lawyer's office trying to remember that I was making the right choice. I told her honestly, I regret that it had to be a fight. I don't regret that I had to be a fight. There's a difference. It took me a while to understand that, but I think it's one of the more important things I know now. Protection is not aggression. Knowing your rights is not the same as being difficult. And refusing to disappear, refusing to let your child disappear, is not something you should ever have to apologize for. I know that now, and I think, in some quiet part of herself, my daughter will know it too. I think about that envelope sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. Usually on the first of the month when the deposit comes through, or when my daughter does something small and ordinary that reminds me she exists because I chose to let her exist. $250,000 is not a small number. I want to be honest about that. There were nights, early on, when the practical part of my brain ran the numbers over and over: the debt, the rent, the salary, the uncertainty. That voice was not irrational. It was the same voice that had gotten me through harder things before. I don't think it was wrong to listen to it. I just think it was working with incomplete information. What it didn't know, what I didn't know yet, was that the envelope wasn't an offer. It was a test of whether I understood my own position. And the answer, when I finally sat across from my lawyer and heard her explain what the federal child support guidelines actually meant for someone with his income, was that I had been about to trade something worth significantly more for something that came with a gag order attached. That's not a metaphor, that's just the math. But I've been thinking lately about what actually got me through it, and I don't think it was the math. The math helped. The legal framework helped. Having a lawyer who treated me like someone with agency and not just a problem to be managed, that helped enormously. But what got me out of the car in that parkade? What got me to pick up the phone the next morning? What kept me showing up to appointments and reading documents at 11 at night while eating crackers that came from somewhere else? Part of it was something I can only describe as knowing the difference between right and wrong and being unwilling to perform confusion about it. They wanted me to act as though what they were asking was reasonable, to use words like practical and nod along. I couldn't do it. Not because I was brave. I wasn't particularly brave. I was mostly scared. But because I had a clear enough sense of what was actually happening that pretending otherwise felt like something I'd have to live with for a long time. Part of it was using my head when my emotions were pulling in 5 directions at once. I asked questions. I found people who knew more than I did. I didn't sign anything before I understood it. That sounds basic. It isn't. When someone with more resources than you is counting on urgency and isolation to make you move fast. And part of it, the part I'm most grateful for now, was just not stopping. There were moments when the other side delayed or submitted incomplete documents, or made a new offer designed to make me feel like I was being unreasonable for continuing. I kept going, not out of anger. Out of something quieter than that. A decision I'd already made about what I owed my daughter before she was even born. She's almost 2 now. She doesn't know any of this yet. One day she might ask, and I'll tell her in whatever way makes sense for who she is by then. What I'll want her to understand is that the outcome wasn't luck. It was the result of specific choices made under pressure, one after another, by someone who was tired and scared and doing it anyway. That's available to most people. It doesn't require wealth or connections or a particular kind of courage. It requires knowing what's right, thinking clearly, and refusing to quit before it's actually over. That's what I know now. That's what I'll tell her.